Well, good evening everybody, and thanks to Tony for that kind introduction and the team of Impactt for organising tonight. I would say, for those of you who haven't had the chance to read it, and this is an out-and-out plug for this report, if you haven't read it, please do so, and get past the executive summary. It's well worth reading, and it tells a story in some ways that is a bit harsh, and there's a harsh reality there. But it also tells a story, I think, of increasing potential. And Tony's already touched on some of the research findings, and he talked about how Impactt survey points this very bleak picture of supply chains, with 2/3 of workers not receiving a recognised minimum wage, or 1/5 of all the sites that they visited having child labour. Frankly, that's unacceptable to all of us here. And I think it's a fairly depressing thought that after 10 years we're still seeing data like that. The root causes, well, we could wax lyrical about them. They're numerous, they're varied. They link corporate activity, they link cultures, they link different society actions, and so on and so forth. But for me, what this report brings out, and what increasingly we're starting to see, is that you can't treat any of those root causes in isolation. And there's this whole plethora of very interconnected issues that some of them, individually, it's in one or more of our gifts to address, but others aren't. And where that leaves us for me is very challenging, because it starts to sort of say the traditional way that we've looked at ethical trade is not the way that's going to be successful in the future. And the report, I will point this quote out, says that labour rights aren't going to be just sold by brands and retailers. I think that's very important, but I think those brands and those retailers have a very important role to play, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So where does it leave us in terms of what has changed over the past 10 years? Because I don't want this to be a very depressing conversation. And despite those statistics, I think that we have to see this in terms of a glass that is half full rather than half empty. I guess that all of us wouldn't be here tonight if we didn't think in those terms, because frankly, if we did, we'd have probably packed up on this whole ethical trade malarkey years ago and just gone home and left apparently intractable problems to be unsolved and left to others. But we didn't pack up and go home. And so for me, if you try and characterise the last 10 years or so, it's about two key things and two key changes in terms of approach and attitude. And I think now we have a much more collaborative approach. We're much more engaging in terms of how we work on the ground. And we recognise, certainly from a corporate perspective, that you can't hide behind legal smokescreens, and that we can work in partnership with others to try and address some of these very difficult issues. And we also have a growing attitude that says we can make those changes happen. And I think there are a number of catalysts to that. There's the ETI, the trade union sector, which Tony has really driven this activity through, the NGO sector, and of course I wouldn't forget about the media or consumers. I don't know what the collective noun for a group of catalysts is. If somebody can enlighten me later, then please do so. But I think you've got to include Impactt in that group. Because on more than one occasion, for me, they've demonstrated that on a practical level, they've shown me the art of the possible. And they've proved for many their aim of making what's good for workers also good for business. And that's one of the thorniest questions we've had to answer. And that increasing desire to tackle the issues gives me a lot of confidence for the future. We're not out of the woods yet. It'd be foolish to suggest that we are. But I do think now, 10 years on, we have a better compass to help us find the way. And after 10 years, for me, Impactt are a very important part of that, and I work with them on a variety of issues. And I characterise their approach as both creative and collaborative in a way that they help us to find pragmatic solutions. But increasingly as well, everybody's work in these fields is less about auditing, and it's more about finding those creative ways of working together to tackle the challenges and the complexities that all this work on improving labour standards is about. It's not about marketing puffery. Anybody who thinks that, really, well, they're not in the room tonight. It's not just about protecting reputations, although that's clearly a part of it. Increasingly, I think we all recognise it's about rolling up our sleeves and working to activate change. And I picked that word very carefully, because I think if that change is going to be sustainable, it can't be something that one party does or one party just implements. Instead, it has to be owned, it has to be shared by all of the actors and meet a range of people's different perspectives. I think we need the right policy and legislative framework that's correctly applied. We need the right corporate engagement with recognition of corporate impact. We need active union and worker representation. We need a vocal NGO and civil society contribution. But actually we need all of those collectively working together, because building informed collaboration between all those different people, for me, is the most important thing. And doing that with drive and with energy will make that change happen. 10 years ago we didn't have much of a toolkit, I don't think, for all of this ethical trade work. And now we don't have the full toolkit, but we have a good proportion of it. And we're starting to see changes happen. But where will we be in 10 years' time? Well, that's a really difficult question for us. Those changes that are happening are still tiny in terms of the whole of the world stage. And our challenge is to drive scale into that change. I think that industry particularly is uniquely placed to drive scale, because we sit between policymakers and grassroots implementers, but equally we can't do it alone. You know, at Cadbury we have a phrase, it's join up and scale up, and for a global business like ours it's a very simple recognition of the fact that linking things together is far more effective than ploughing lone furrows, no matter how closely aligned they might be. Well, I think that applies just as much to what we're talking about this evening, and with activities of groups like the ETI, people like Impactt, framing and support from civil society, and the growing awareness of what's good for workers can be good for business. I'm far more confident we can tackle some of the harsh realities that the research in this report brings out. These are challenges, frankly, that we can't afford to ignore. They are tough, but again, if you quote this report, we need to try to make some progress rather than wait for that perfect solution. And if we do so, and if we do that collaboratively, then I'm much more confident that our shared ambitions will be achieved and those labour standards that we all care about will improve. Thank you for your time.